In the folklore of the Kurdalen people, otherwise known as the Skitsfish, there exists a rather unique lake monster. Unique in the sense that the lake itself is the monster. This entity is the Hînqûmemen, supposedly meaning Engulfer in Hînqûmemen. Yes, I more than likely butchered both words, and I could not even verify if the translation, or the spelling for that matter, are actually correct. It is an unfortunate fact that the Kurdalen language is critically endangered. While there are a couple of books analyzing and teaching it, no dictionary is accessible online. Hence, I have to trust that the information presented in the few bestiaries covering the Engulfer is indeed correct. Which I cannot help but second guess. Each and every entry mentions the Kurdalen people as a British Columbian tribe. However, every source specifically covering them points to a well-defined territory, an area covering parts of Idaho, Washington and Montana, with Lake Kurdalen in its center. It is next to British Columbia, but I don't think anyone calls states adjacent to the border Canadian either. What could be the cause of the confusion is that Salish, which is essentially the predecessor of their language, was actually spoken in that region. Still, kind of an obvious screw-up and a consistent one, so I'm inclined to believe that these secondary sources have had heavily incestuous relationships. Granted, there was one book I could not locate for the life of me, except for a $200 physical version from Amazon, but since it is listed as the source for books I have read, I have a strong feeling the key to this creature is not hidden within those pages. Still, feel free to tell me whether everything in this video is invalidated by that antique tome, if any of you happen to have it. But enough of the padding. What is this creature really? The Engulfer is described as a body of water, one that is capable of autonomous motion. It dwells in a particular lake as a distinct entity, or is the lake itself? While the latter is strongly implied, the way it behaves gives credence to the former theory. Either way, the lake it is linked to is greatly feared. If anyone happens to draw water from it, the Hînqûmemen rises up in disapproval, ready to strike. At first, this may seem like a weak threat, as one might think the being is constrained by the water, unable to leave its confines. That, however, is definitely not the case. The true uniqueness of the Engulfer comes from the fact that it can pursue its victims over land. It separates itself from the rest of the lake and gives chase to the water thief. The Hînqûmemen takes no particular form. It remains amorphous, just a mass of liquid flowing after its target. There is no indication of how fast the entity is, but considering that most sources mention how the victims are followed back to their dwellings, it is either rather slow or begins the pursuit with a significant delay. Either way, when it reaches the person who drew the water, the Engulfer, quite literally, engulfs them and carries them back to the location they dipped their container. Interestingly, it is only then that the Hînqûmemen begins to drown them by dragging the victim into the swelling depth of the lake itself. This has to mean that the being takes care not to envelop their nose or mouth. It is intelligent. This is not an animal hunting for prey. It is something taking revenge, as the circumstances of the death are shown to matter a great deal. Suffocation at the place of the perceived sin. With all that said, this tactic seems to have worked. It is said that the Skitsfish avoid that lake for fear of their lives. Such terror was inspired by the killing, or killings, that these people not only refrained from taking its water, they elected not to even go near it. Can't blame them, to be honest. You never know what the monster's lake might take offense to. Now, unfortunately, it seems to be unknown which lake this might have been. The former Kurdalen territory included 3 large bodies of water, them being Lake Kurdalen, unsurprisingly, Lake Hayden and Lake Pendorile. Of these 3, Lake Hayden is the smallest by a long shot, but even that one is too large to be a likely candidate. While not impossible, it is unlikely that a significant source of water was deemed unusable by a tale that can easily be proven wrong. Inadvertently so. But there are other options in the area. Smaller ponds like Rose Lake. It is far more probable that one of these lesser locations was stigmatized as the Engulfer. And that's about it. This is all we know.
Roll credit.
That's what I'd say if I was one of those channels that just read a lore excerpt and call it a day. No, there's some stuff we can speculate on, and we didn't even get to the spec evo part. So, is the Hînqûmemen an entity that is separate from the lake, or the lake itself? We can disregard what the sources say for this bit, as they almost unanimously write it is the lake. However, the drawn water does not react in any way. With how the tale is recounted, it seems like something distinct from the pond has to gather, manifest, or swim to the place the heinous crime was committed at. Instead of the pot or bucket making a run for it, or taking matters into its own hands, it remains inanimate. Additionally, there is seemingly no adverse effect to drinking it. You'd imagine that such a likely and rather notable interaction with the stone liquid would be noteworthy enough to be mentioned in a few words, but since it isn't, we can extrapolate that the rest of the lake is benign, or at least lacks the power to hurt its consumers. Granted, the wording of some sources implies that the whole lake rises to deliver justice, which would invalidate this part of my thought experiment. Still, I think there is more evidence in support of my claim. Whichever the case, there is one more thing to strain our brains over. What was the origin or purpose of the tale? Well, one obvious possibility is flooding. Rain is not mentioned in the story, but melting snow from the nearby mountains could also lead to a rapidly expanding coastline. Perhaps one person took their water from one of the small lakes fed by the Kurdalan River, a place that was not normally used for such purposes. This could even be considered a strange act. Then it's all followed by a flash flood, taking that person with it. The body is found in that very lake once the natural disaster is over, and the legend is born. Alternatively, the lake may be one with a treacherous bank, one that has claimed many lives, especially those of children. As a countermeasure, a tale inspiring horror is spun as an attempt to keep people from accidentally falling in. This is generally the origin of lake monsters, and may very well apply here too. It might even be reinforced by people slipping while drawing water, found face down by their peers later on. These are, at the very least, the possible causes of the tales I could think of. It may very well just be a piece of media meant to entertain people in an odd yet intriguing way. However, divorcing ourselves from the context, the confines of what we know Earth to be today, could there be an alternate reality where the Hînqûmemen is an actual living creature? Is such an outlandish being even a possibility? Well, it actually is. Now, naturally, I'm not talking about actual autonomous water. No, what I have in mind is a tad less fantastical, and while impressive, not nearly as capable or intelligent as the Engulfer. But what creature could be the basis of such a unique thing? Amorphous, capable of movement, and rather sizable. What probably first comes to mind for most of us when trying to equate fantasy slime with something real are amoeba. The only problem would be that the largest known species, Chaos carolensis, can only reach a maximum of about 5 mm. While it is massive for a single-celled organism, it falls woefully short of something that could stop a human in its tracks. Well, the next logical step would be to imagine a superorganism, a group of small individuals working together. While it seems like a viable option, it is not necessarily the right one for us. Synthropy is the phenomenon that kind of follows this logic. A group of microorganisms coming together to feed when facing hardships they cannot survive alone. Unfortunately, it is not predation that is facilitated by such a transformation. These superorganisms most commonly feed on metabolic products. It is not surprising such congregations do not opt to pursue prey larger than them, as they would lack adequate coordination and speed to do so. Even if they may potentially possess the capability to detect, catch, and to a degree distribute food sources, this is far from the best option for them. They are more likely to find success cannibalizing each other, or opt to sustain themselves by means other than predation. However, there are beings for whom the core of this idea is not at all far-fetched. Slime molds. The name is slightly misleading. They are not actually a kind of mold. They are not even fungi. These interesting entities can best be categorized as protista, eukaryotic beings that are grouped together out of convenience, really, as they do not belong to any other kingdom. Either way, many slime molds exist, but all of them can roughly be distributed into 3 classes. Protostelias are individual cells living separate lives, but doing so in close association. They can sprout fruiting bodies that produce spores and generally consume decomposer organisms. Not quite what we are looking for. Dictyostelids are a bit more interesting in their behavior. They spend most of their lives as regular amoebae, feeding and dividing. However, when their food source is depleted, they start emitting a chemical that causes them to congregate into slug-like masses. Then they look for an ideal spot to produce a fruiting body. Some of them form the stem and the rest produce spores at the tip, hoping that at least part of the new generation finds a place of abundant food by hitching a ride on animals or air currents. Fascinating, but still not something I'd call a useful basis. The third group are Myxogastria. This is a huge class with a rather high number of known species and a complicated life cycle. They begin with a monocellular stage, which is not important for us as it pertains to spores and amoeba-like cells that sprout from them. The second trophic stage is what we are really after. This entails the development of the plasmodium, which is essentially a large mass of cytoplasm with a massive number of nuclei within. Practically one huge cell that did not divide, but opted to use its unity as an advantage. This plasmodium is a slowly pulsating slime-like entity that is capable of movement, scouting its area for food. They generally consume dead matter and leave a chemical trail to know where they've already been. This odd, often vibrantly colored mass can reach a respectable size, with some naturally occurring individuals closing in on a 1 meter diameter. Seems promising. I'd consider Physarum polycephalum as the best model species for what we want to achieve. An artificially cultivated piece of this mold, that is, one cell, exceeded a surface area of 5 square meters. This shows us that there is certainly capacity to occupy the same amount of space as a sizable puddle would. This model species itself is not exactly picky either. The amoeba stage can be predatory or live off of dead microbes, while the plasmodium consumes dead organic matter, enveloping the snack at hand. One could even say, engulfing it. Physarum polycephalum is relatively ubiquitous and is not exactly the pinnacle of evolution. Therefore, we can theorize a scenario where a similar slime mold developed in what is today northern Idaho and found limited success in a few habitats. Its plasmodium is brownish with a glossy, bad-looking surface, not too different from a puddle of mud or wet dirt. It slowly scouts the bank of a lake, but dead matter is not its only source of nutrition. Since it's a rather inconspicuous, barely moving pool of silent death, animals often try to walk over or land on it, especially arthropods. However, its body is thick, viscous and sticky, and something living comes into contact with it, the Hînqûmemen knows. If the creature is not strong or alert enough to quickly rid itself of the slime, there is enough time for it to make a move. It begins to engulf the animal no matter how big or small. With every passing second, it becomes a little harder to escape. The cytoplasm moves back and forth with a set rhythm. For Physarum polycephalum, the flow switches direction about every 100 seconds, but for the Hînqûmemen, it is in its best interest to be as quick as possible at this stage. The 1 mm per second speed of its close relative is already impressive, but our predatory slime would be capable of exceeding that. While I do not have any knowledge of what the top speed with an optimized network of tubes could be, I suspect it would be rather terrifying in context. If food is abundant, the plasmodium would just keep on growing and growing. While it could only eat small insects at first, it may transition to frogs, lesser mammals, birds, larger mammals. Picture this. Someone goes down to a lake to draw water. The weather is humid, everything is wet and muddy. There is a spot where this fictional skitfish could get very close to the pond. It is even clear of foliage, but there seems to be a murky puddle right by the bank. It's just some mud on the ground. They are already covered in wet dirt, what's a bit more? The unsuspecting victim takes a confident step into the pool, but it is as if their foot has just submerged in tar. Unfortunately, momentum carries them forward, but with one leg already stuck, they fall on their knees. This strange substance is rather disgusting, but it holds them firmly, and any attempt to stand back up is in vain. The Kurdalan looks for something to grab onto, try and pull themselves free, but that's when they notice something terrifying. The mud beneath them is moving. It is making its way up their leg. A horrific awakening. They lose their balance once more, falling elbow first into even more of the puddle. The tingling of the living lake slowly turns into pain as their flesh is consumed little by little. They scream, but no one is nearby. Could anyone even help at this point? Wailing in terror, the realization begins to sink in. Their fate is sealed. Yet death may be hours away. A horrible way to go, no argument there. Their body, or what little remains, would be found right where they attempted to draw water, perhaps with the Hînqûmemen still insidiously creeping around. More than enough to sprout tales of a vengeful lake, especially with witnesses. I'd certainly avoid any place where a wrong step could end up with me dissolved into a bundle of bones. Naturally, engulfers of such size would be the exception and not the norm. Most would be barely more than smears on the ground, but it would still be a bad idea to step onto them with naked feet. Yeah, just avoid them at any stage. There is a Halloween special coming later this month, but I don't think that tops this one in terms of abject horror. One of the creatures with the least amount of available lore, yet hands down the most disturbing Spec Evo project I've done to date. I hope you found some level of entertainment in this macabre mutation of the legends. If for some reason you did, well, there is a Discord channel where we do stuff like this and more, so you are welcome to join that. There's a link to it in the description next to my Patreon where, you can support the making of stuff like this. I don't blame anyone who'd rather not, to be honest. It's better if I just leave, so bye.